Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Snowy Toolbox Seminar. Ideally, we have Toolbox Seminars not in the winter during storms, but so be it. Thank you for those who are able to make it here physically in person, and those of you who are on the webinar in your offices, safe and sound, welcome as well. Today, we're going to have the presenters who are also a little bit late. I'm sure will be here soon. What we decided to do today is to focus on some litigation issues which are very current. Ian Blue, sitting to my left, will be talking about something very topical. What about interprovincial trade? Ian will talk about a case that he's argued in front of the Supreme Court of Canada recently, and when you listen to the news today, the battle between Alberta and BC is heating up, and it's a very topical thing to discuss. Gavin, Tighe, one of our litigation partners, will be here talking about defamation in the Internet age, particularly relevant in some of the issues we're involved with today in determining due diligence for clients and accusations that may be totally false. But how do you stop it? What do you do when a client is defamed or potentially is threatened with defamation? And Soma Ray-Ellis will be talking as well. She recently joined us to head up our employment law area, and the METOO movement is in the news every day. More and more people are being added to the list. How do you deal with that as an employer? How do you deal with it as someone who threatens or is threatened? Soma will address those issues. Those are going to be the main topics. I'm going to do our hot topic today. Again, something relevant but nothing to do with litigation yet. We're going to talk about American tax reform and its potential impact on Canada. These are the areas that I'm going to highlight. This is a very detailed and complex new law, probably 400 plus pages of changes to the Internal Revenue Code, and I'm only going to deal with a few selected items, and really at a 50,000-foot level, to give you a sense of what are some of the changes, their importance, and their impact on Canadians. We'll talk about tax reform specifically in North America and then internationally, looking at the changes in the corporate tax rates, changes in individual tax rates, the estate tax. There are new limits, surprisingly, on the deductibility of interest, whether it's arm's length or non-arm's length. The adoption of the Americans in terms of corporate ownership of foreign affiliates, the Canadian type of exempt surplus system, they call it participation exemption, but it's almost the same. And then finally, structuring investments into the U.S. and what's the danger today of using a partnership. So let's start with looking at the corporate tax rates. The paradigm seems to change every several years. Should we be structuring, let's say, investments into Canada from the U.S. or vice versa to take advantage of lower rates in one jurisdiction or another? For the last several years, with, say, the combined rates in Ontario, 26.5% for Americans investing in Canada, whereas in New York or California, the aggregate corporate rate would be around 40%. My advice has always been to Americans, leave your investments in Canada to grow at a lower tax rate. Now the rates are falling in the U.S. The federal rate is going to go down from 35% to 21%. You have to add on certain taxes from some states that could be quite high. So the average will be in the mid-20s. Very comparable to the Canadian system, so that tax rate arbitrage is no longer there. And we have to think about, is there an advantage in shifting profits, and if so, how do we do it, given the world of transparency and the automatic exchange of information, the initiatives of the OECD, particularly with the study that I've talked about in previous sessions, base erosion and profit shifting, and trying to limit multinational corporations from shifting profits and avoiding tax. So in this now emerging world of international pressure on multinational corporations, and from the U.S. point of view, their push for everything American, the fact that they've lowered their taxes very significantly will have a big impact on how really global tax planning, not just Canadian, but global tax planning reacts to that. Are other countries going to lower taxes? Well, Canada's not, obviously. We're looking at some would call a tax grab. Recently in Davos, Prime Minister Trudeau said he's against the way big corporations are shifting their profits improperly. He has no intention of lowering corporate tax rates. Are we going to remain competitive? To me, that's a big question mark. Individual tax rates. Here, there's much reduced minimization. The top rate federally goes from 39.6% to 37%, but it ends in 2025. There are a number of these provisions which we'll touch on that show the compromise that had to be reached between the Republicans and the Conservatives, the Democrats, to get the legislation passed. And a number of these relieving measures, particularly on the individual level, are very short-lived. Just a couple of days ago, some leading Democrats said, we're so unhappy with this bill. If we win the midterm elections and get control of the House of Representatives, we're going to try to repeal everything because it's so unfair. We'll see. But right now, we have to be aware in our planning that these are not permanent. These are, even under the Republican legislation, temporary. And I mentioned in certain high-tax states, when you look at the state tax on top of the even reduced federal tax, it's still mid-40s almost. Interestingly, the long-term capital gains and qualified dividend rates of 20% remain unchanged. And what Obama brought in, the surcharge of 3.8% on investment income, remains unchanged. Pass-through income is interesting. A lot of Americans typically set up a LLC, a limited liability company, to be able to have the income not taxed at the entity level but passed through to the individual members of the LLC, or they could use a partnership or a so-called S corporation, which can elect to have the income passed through. And the Americans have done that as a way of coping with the potential for double taxation because they don't have an integrated tax system with dividend tax credits the way we do. So recognizing that problem, what they have done in the tax reform is to look at qualified income. So, for example, professional income isn't qualified, but trading income would be. The entity is allowed a 20% deduction when the income is passed through. So as a result, the effective top individual tax rate, instead of what I showed on the previous slide, is going to be 29.6%, which is a significant incentive to set up a corporation and use it in the U.S. for individuals as opposed to earning it individually. Is that something that certainly the Democrats may object to, but generally the population at large, is this something that they feel comfortable with, keeping in mind the controversy we've had in Canada since the summer about the use of corporations to earn income? And it expires in 8 years. This is also interesting. There was a lot of talk when Trump was trying to win the nomination for the Republican Party that he was going to abolish the estate tax, the death tax he called it. Well, they couldn't get it abolished. But what they've done is they've doubled the exemption for a limited period again. So individuals in the U.S. can have an $11.2 million exemption from the application of the estate tax, which can be as high as 40%, over $2 million of gross estate value. And for a couple, then it's a little over $22 million of exemption. In Canada, we have to think very carefully about how to take advantage of that if we have American assets. If we have American real estate that has to be thrown. So we look at the value of the U.S. assets versus the worldwide assets, and we're allowed to have an exemption fraction multiplied by the value under that arrangement. If non-real estate, if it's shares of U.S. companies, then you just get exempt of the treaty. Here's a surprising change: limit on interest deductibility. Every large business in the U.S., you have to have at least $5 million gross revenue, will face a limitation on ability to deduct interest, whether to a non-arm's party or to an arm's financial institution. And I've given the formula here in words, but essentially it's no more than 30% of your adjusted income otherwise determined. So what's behind the BEAT project, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, from the OECD, in which the American government, one of the lead powers in the OECD, though it objects to the automatic exchange of information, they only have FATCA, don't go along with the CRA, the Common Reporting Standard, to have bilateral automatic exchange of information with all countries that sign up to this. They don't agree with all of the BEAPs, but surprisingly they did agree with this. And even more surprisingly, the Republicans agreed with this. So here we have a large corporation that is financing its business, its expansion, so in the U.S. side, interest payable to anybody, they're going to cap on their interest. If they have a Canadian subsidiary, for example, you might expect that they're going to shift their borrowing down to Canada, where we don't have this 30% deduction. So we're going to look at an erosion of our tax base. I think that's a big danger for us. And as I say, was the BEAT initiative, and it could be very well negative for our competitiveness. Now we're going to get into international tax reform. This is, to me, progressive. I've often talked to American clients about how the Canadian tax system, where you set up a parent corporation in Canada and subsidiaries abroad, instead of U.S. subsidiaries abroad, because under the old system, if a subsidiary paid tax in Ireland, Germany, where Canada, and then paid the after-tax of the parent, it was fully included in income. There was foreign tax generally available for the right kind of corporation, but often it was inadequate because the tax rates in the U.S. were so high. So that's why so many multinationals that were U.S.-based were keeping their profits offshore. An estimated several $1 trillion outside the U.S., and that was a huge political issue. So to solve it, they turned to the Canadian system in other countries as well. Of course, Netherlands and other countries have this participation exemption. The thrust of it, and the transition tax will just get there, they think, but the thrust of it is that, again, American parent and an active corporation in a foreign jurisdiction, a dividend comes now to the right kind of American corporation, tax-free. The income, the dividend income is deductible as it is in Canada in computing taxable income. So from the point of view of very large American corporations, you read it in the newspapers how they are planning on bringing huge profits back, talking about paying bonuses to employees, increasing investments back in the U.S. So that has been a tremendous incentive created for U.S.-based multinationals to address that big political issue. And frankly, it makes tremendous economic sense to allow multinationals to shift around back to the U.S. and so on without incurring tax. You want the free movement of capital and not a tax barrier to that. but it's a very different system, full taxability to tax-free income. How do you get from one to the other? This transition tax was intended to address that. It's a penalty. And when we look at every U.S. shareholder, so we talked about multinationals, but now this applies to every U.S. shareholder. Could be a citizen, U.S. citizen living in Canada, resident in Canada. That person has specified corporation, and generally those are controlled foreign corporations with at least one U.S. corporate shareholder. The income post-state that has been earned and accumulated in a foreign corporation, even though it hasn't been paid back to the U.S., and should be individuals so our corporations are to some U.S. corporations brought back to the U.S. A lot of corporations have shifted, whether it's was to block or to give it to help. So these are the two really exclusive yes corporation. It's a pure pass-through, but for purposes of the Canada-U.S. tax treaty, and this participation exemption, they may have to change that S corp, which is just like our regular Ontario corporation. I think we're going to see some changes and structured in order to address their tax income. Back to the BEEP project, the foreign corporations, particularly in tax havens, with are royalties under various agreements and share profits for high tax jurisdictions. And the argument is it's not just legal ownership of these intellectual properties in the offshore affiliates. Need to have actual operations which can be pointed to other sense, they shoot themselves in the foot. Stop. If and the tax havens are real, they're going to lose jobs from the U.S. to the tax havens. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's the risk this policy runs. And what the U.S. will on U.S. shareholders, including U.S. citizens, residents, tax old so the U.S. come up with what is the earn on tangible profits, it might be 10%. And if because the let's say the Amazon brand has been shifted to Ireland, a low-tax jurisdiction, and generates super profits, anything above that 10%, let's say they earn 50%. So the additional 40% will be subject to this new tax currently in the U.S. on profits that have not been repatriated, simply earned, not by the U.S. corporation, but by controlled foreign affiliates. It's an expansion of their Subpart F rules. And a U.S. corporate shareholder at least is able to get a deduction of 50%. So instead of the new tax rate of 21% applying, only 10.5% is the net cost. And looking at how the focus is on low tax income, so the arithmetic shows that the break-even point is 13.125% for the foreign tax. It's not likely that there's going to be a lot of Canadian, let's call it guilty type of income included with the U.S., but we have to think about that, especially if there are significant deductions in Canada where there isn't a high tax that applies in a particular year. And then this is another part of the incentive for American corporations to bring their operations back to the U.S., which could be subject to significant challenge. The U.S. wants to encourage American companies to export their goods and services. So for foreign-derived intangible income, let's say that an American corporation has, through foreign branches, trademarks and patents and so on associated with exports that generate profits for the sale of property to foreign persons or services to foreign persons. That fits into this new FDII category, and instead of the regular rate of 21%, there's an incentive rate at 13.125%. It goes up after 2025. So what the world now, particularly some European countries, are looking at is, and they're questioning, isn't the U.S. giving an export advantage to U.S. companies that violate the rules in the World Trade Organization, which say that everything should be neutral. You shouldn't have disincentives for imports or exports, and you shouldn't have incentives. Everything should be neutral. And the final item that I wanted to touch on is capital gains on sales of U.S. partnership interests. Typically, when we look at how Canadians should invest in the U.S., our systems in terms of entities are similar but not identical, and particularly if Canadians invest through limited liability companies in the U.S., we've often been confronted with significant double tax issues where Canada looks at the LLC as a corporation, the U.S. looks at it as a partnership. And so there may be, particularly with passive income, U.S. tax, but also Canadian tax, and there may be a mismatch resulting in double taxation. And there was a recent case in the U.S. where a non-resident group of investors invested in a U.S. business, not directly, but through a partnership. And they disposed of the partnership interest instead of the assets of the business. And the then current law in the U.S. said that's a capital gain that's tax-free. So now, to address that, a disposing partner will be treated as if it sold the underlying business assets instead of the partnership interest. And so could be subject, if it's a corporation, to a regular corporate tax of 21%, and for individuals, the federal tax rate of 37%, instead of the long-term capital gains rates for individuals of 20%. So it is a significant barrier that we have to think about when we're structuring investments into the U.S. not to use partnerships if we can help it. It would be much better from this point of view to go with a Canadian holding company or parent company and a U.S. subsidiary to do the same kind of business, so that if there is a sale by a Canadian owner, it's now a Canadian owner not of a partnership interest, but of shares of a U.S. company. And then one would have to look at where, what do the shares derive their principal value from? If it's from U.S. real estate, similar to our rules in Canada, they call it FIRPTA, the Foreign Investor Real Property Tax Act. It could be subject to U.S. corporate tax, but if it's not derived more than 50% from U.S. real estate, the Canadian corporation could be selling the shares of the U.S. sub tax-free from a U.S. point of view, which is obviously a big advantage. Yes, sir. That's okay. That won't be a problem. It's the cross-border part that they're concerned about. That's a domestic plan, which is fine. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Not so much individuals. What I was talking about was, where are the U.S. corporations going to be setting up their operations? Are they still going to be inverting? Are they going to be setting up subsidiaries, say, in the U.S., bringing profits back to the U.S.? That's, I think, an open question still. And their policies, in some senses, are contradictory. The participation exemption encourages people or corporations to be U.S.-based and bring their profits back. The GILTI tax and so on is the opposite. It's saying you're U.S., you're going to pay a penalty simply because you have offshore profits. Even though they were active business assets, they weren't subject to their Subpart F rules, it's still negative. So that was a longer hot topic than I thought, but it's appropriate. Now we've got Gavin with us, and he'll be speaking after. But what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Ian to talk about the interprovincial free trade matters that, as I mentioned, are very current today. And Ian can talk about the experience with the case that he's recently argued in the Supreme Court of Canada. Thank you for your attention. Oh, just before I do, let me remind you, everybody has one of these, the evaluation sheets. Very important to us if you please fill them out so that we get feedback and suggestions for next topics. Thank you. It's much, generally 55 minutes, but it's taking a minute.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Lorne is giving me a good introduction, and I had intended to refer you to the news last night. Alberta is going to ban the import of British Columbia wine. It's in a hissy fit about the British Columbia government's proposal to promulgate new regulations about the effects of offshore oil spills. And it's illustrative of a very big problem we have in Canada today. Today, Canada risks becoming nothing but a geographical expression of 13 independent chiefs, all claiming that they run things, and trade arming the federal government out of the way. And interprovincial trade barriers are a symptom of that problem. We have thousands of interprovincial trade barriers. You cannot buy Quebec milk in Ontario. You cannot buy Ontario milk in Manitoba. You cannot buy chickens or eggs or yogurt from any other province but Ontario. Workers in Ontario may not work in Quebec. And I could go on and on and on. This has been a mystery to me for years because of a provision in our Constitution, which I'm going to talk about. Okay, Linda. We had a case of one particular trade barrier. Okay. And this involved a retired millwright in the province of New Brunswick named Gerard Comeau. He lived in Tracadie, New Brunswick. That is across the Restigouche River from Pointe à la Croix and the Listowel First Nations Indian Reserve in Quebec. It's about a 5-minute drive. Everybody in Tracadie goes across the river to buy beer and liquor at the sack because it's half the price it is in New Brunswick. That, however, led to trouble. Once he arrived at the SAC in Quebec, the RCMP were in the parking lot. They were observing him. He purchased a good quantity of beer, wine, and liquor, and he drove back across the bridge. The RCMP followed him to the border, radioed their friends in Tracadie, who stopped him, arrested him, and charged him with violating Section 134.1 of the New Brunswick Liquor Control Act. And that's a provision we find in every Liquor Control Act across the country. And it says that people shall not have in their possession any liquor that has not been purchased at the Provincial Liquor Commission. That means that when I drive from Toronto to visit family in Quebec, and I take a couple of bottles of wine with me, I am breaking the law. This is a trade barrier. I was retained by the Canadian Constitutional Foundation to challenge this rule. And how did I challenge it? I challenged it under Section 121 of our Constitution Act. And Section 121 says that all articles of growth, produce, or manufacture of any one of the provinces shall from and after Confederation be admitted free into each of the other provinces. That's a pretty clear free trade guarantee provision. And what happened? Why has that section never been used before? Well, the answer is very simple. 98 years ago, in a case called Gold Seal versus Dominion Express, our Supreme Court of Canada, as it then was, said that all that Section 121 meant was that provinces could not establish customs posts at the provincial border and could not charge customs duties. Full stop. That was the only thing that Section 121 prevented. Now that was very curious because in 1920, This was 53 years after Confederation. It had been 53 years since any of the provinces had ever had customs duty. The decision made no sense when it was made. It made no sense today. Now, the case was followed 4 times. I won't bore you with the details, but each time when people tried to attack the Canadian Wheat Board, tried to attack some of the supply management legislation in the 70s, the court said, no, no, that is not a duty at the provincial border. It is a law. Section 121 does not stop it. Well, what has changed since 1920? What's very interesting for a lawyer like me who was around litigating long before 1982 is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms have changed all the rules about constitutional interpretation. And they haven't said those rules apply only to the Charter. They said they apply to the Constitution. They said it applies to the Constitution because they don't want to be criticized for making rules specific only to the Charter. So the court said in 2003, the Constitution is a living tree. It must be interpreted according to new circumstances as they arise. And that's a fundamental tenet now of our Constitution. They also said, well, you have to make a purposeful interpretation of the Constitution. You don't just read the words and say, I think they mean such and so. Oh, no, we can't do that. You've got to look at the wording of the Act, the legislative history of the provision, the scheme of the Act, and the legislative context of the provision. That is all very metaphysical, but now that is what they have said. So what we did in the Comeau case is we did that analysis. We looked at the history. And what we found was that Section 121 said goods shall be admitted free. We dug around in the statute books before Confederation, and we found that all of the other free trade provisions in the 1830s, 1840s still said shall be admitted free from duty. And what had made the change between those earlier laws and what was in our Constitution was the fact that in the mid-19th century, the world was changing very, very rapidly, and people had experience with non-trade barriers, and Section 121 was written to ensure that provinces could not have non-trade barriers. That was very clear in the statements of politicians made prior to Confederation, very clear about when the British North America Act was enacted. That was the intention, that there should be complete free trade among the provinces. Now, the reason that people in the British North American colonies were concerned about free trade was they had had it from 1854 into 1864. Britain and the United States had negotiated a complete free trade agreement called the Reciprocity Treaty. It was the most prosperous time in Canadian history. This is when we built all the big buildings in Toronto and Montreal. This is when we built the bridges over the St. Lawrence. This is when we built railways. In that period, that 10-year period, very prosperous. And then, because the British shipyards were building warships and selling them to the Confederacy, the Americans said, "The heck with you, Britain, we're canceling the Reciprocity Treaty." And all of a sudden, the barriers, the tariff barriers went up, the stop and search barriers went up, and all of a sudden, the guys that were selling the wagon loads of lettuce from southern Ontario in Boston got held up at the border 2 weeks. And the whole thing was destroyed. So this is why everyone wanted to have free trade among the provinces in Canada. And the view was that this deal, to have free trade, was part of the business deal of Confederation. It's in a part of the British North America Act which the court said can never be changed. And the idea was that the prosperity created by interprovincial free trade would be a source of revenue to each of the provinces. And as I said, in Section 121, in 1920, Section 121 was misinterpreted by the Supreme Court of Canada in a case that wasn't even about Section 121. I won't go into the details other than to say there was a dirty political interference in the decision by the Federal Minister of Justice, which is a shameful episode in the history of the Supreme Court, and it's never been denied, but it led to the interpretation that is there. And we stated that before the Supreme Court of Canada. So we had a trial down in Fredericton, and to get the history that I've described in, we called the foremost expert in Canadian history at the time of the Constitution, Dr. Andrew Smith. Regretfully, he teaches in Liverpool, England, because he can't get a job in Canada, because history faculties nowadays don't like political historians. They want people studying Housemaid's Knee in Belleville in 1837, and the strike in Edmonton in 1931. So but in any case, he was superb, and he had the court mesmerized. In response, the Crown did not call a historian. They called Dr. Tom Bateman a political scientist. There's an old expression, never bring a knife to a gunfight, and the government brought the knife. Now, in the case, it was very interesting. The Crown did not dispute our legal argument. They did not dispute our analysis of history, our interpretation of Section 121. All the technical argument we made, they did not dispute. Their arguments were entirely political. They said, you can't do this. Canada, you would be interfering with provincial sovereignty. You would be interfering with the principle of exhaustiveness, that total legislative competence lies between the federal and the provincial government. And we said, you're wrong about that, because total legislative competence by governments, both federal and provincial, are subject to all sorts of provisions of the Constitution. Case in point, the Charter. Now, Judge LeBlanc, who heard the trial, gave a very long decision, 85-page decision, on April 29, 2016. He held that the Gold Seal case was wrongly decided. He held that Section 121 meant that there could be no interprovincial trade barriers, tariff or non-tariff. He said that that decision would have a resounding impact. Now, I won't bore you with the details, but this case went directly from Judge LeBlanc to the Supreme Court of Canada. On May the 4th, we learned the court, last year, we learned that the court was going to grant leave to appeal the case. And we supported the Crown's application for leave to appeal because we wanted to get a Supreme Court of Canada decision interpreting Section 121. Now, this was quite the case. 10 governments, the Government of Canada and all other governments except Manitoba and Yukon territories intervened against us. All said, this interpretation of Section 121, which Mr. Comeau's counsel were arguing, would disrupt Confederation. It would spoil the democracy principle. It would spoil the exhaustiveness principle. It would be gross interference in provincial affairs. It would be saying that there were legislative no-go zones for provincial governments. So those were the government interveners. 12 non-government interveners intervened to support us. We had the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, various wine producers, marijuana producers, several other bodies, all with very good counsel, intervened to support us. And the court made the very unusual decision to set aside not 1 but 2 days to hear the case. Most Supreme Court arguments are a morning or an afternoon. This case took 2 days. Now, the court said it's going to reserve its decision. We expect to receive the decision sometime in May or June of this year. Most lawyers will give you a legal opinion that you're going to win or you've got a great chance to win. Any argument before the Supreme Court of Canada, ladies and gentlemen, is a crapshoot. You don't know how they're going to decide. It's that simple. You have Mr. Justice Rowe from Newfoundland worried about what this would do to the jobs of people who work in the St. John's Brewery. You had the Quebec judges worried what this is going to do to the maple syrup industry. You have the Ontario judges to see it the way we see it. So we don't know how it's going to go. Usually they try to have a unanimous decision, but who knows? But one thing is clear. Trade barriers in Canada have resulted in Canadians paying higher prices for Canadian goods than would otherwise be prepared. Now, this one study that we filed by some economists said that the amount added that trade barriers added between 8 and 14% to the cost of all goods and services in Canada. And if you eliminated those trade barriers, they estimate, and this amount is not disputed, this is an accepted amount, a real GDP gain of between 3 to 7%, or between 50 and 130 billion annually. Just think of that. 50 and 130 billion annually increased GDP if we got rid of trade barriers. Another study, and this is by Statistics Canada, this is a formal government study, showed that Canadians pay an implied tariff on everything they buy of about 6.9% due to provincial trade barriers. And that, my friends, contrasts with the United States, where a similar study was done and there was no implied tariff. Interstate trade barriers do not impose material additional costs in the United States. So that affects Canada's competitiveness. We're pretty optimistic that the court will hold that it's time to send the Gold Seal case to retirement. And they will say that it means that Section 121 means something more than prohibiting duties, but how far it will go to completely lowering the interprovincial trade barriers, I think is what we're all waiting to see. 9. The federal government's position was that the Gold Seal case had to go, and there should be more free trade, but we had to respect some of the supply management programs. So we're hoping that we're hoping for a good decision. We're hoping that actually that this dispute between BC and Alberta will of course come to the attention of the court, and that it will influence them, and they can see the danger of the interprovincial trade barriers. Anyway, we think that if they did change it, there would be huge economic potential released, and it would force both provincial and the federal government to remove some of the trade barriers. If you've ever looked at the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that everyone negotiated in the fall of 2016, you'll notice that it has 130 pages of exemptions and a dispute resolution process that is impossible to use because it would take 5 years to resolve any dispute, and then the need for it would be disappeared. So we're waiting for the decision. I say stand by, and thank you very much for your interest and attention.
Gavin Tighe is our next and last speaker.
Okay, good morning. Very brave souls to make it in this morning. Some of us didn't. It was a little, this winter is the never-ending story. So and I don't want to defame the weather. So let me talk, we're going to talk this morning a little bit about the tort of defamation, which you may or everyone's heard of, but I think very few people really have any understanding about, and that's probably a good thing. So basically, what I propose to do is give a quick overview of defamation law in Canada, talk about a little bit about the recent amendments, and actually there's a new case that's coming out. I was hoping that it would come out before today, but it hasn't come out yet. So there's new legislation that may or may not be the end of defamation as we know it in Canada. We'll see how that goes. It's the SLAPP legislation. And I know there was a case argued recently about it, but no decision's been released as of today. So what is defamation? Well, I call it the sticks and stones theory because, you know, we used to always hear sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will ever hurt me. Well, that's not true. Not true at all. In fact, what the old British defamation cases talk about is the sting of the libel. And what the reality of it is that words and statements, particularly today, are perhaps more damaging than they've ever been in history, and certainly more damaging, quite frankly, than a lot of physical harm to all sorts of issues, personal reputation, branding, go on and on. So defamation is any comment that would basically be negative, hold someone up to hatred, contempt, or ridicule, or lower that person in the estimation of a reasonable person who have common sense, who are reasonably thoughtful and well-informed, but do not have an overly fragile sensibility. In other words, you'll know it when you see it. So there's really no true word of defamation. It has primarily the whole law of defamation, as I said, there's quite a history to it. It actually began as a criminal process in England. You could go to jail for defaming someone, and it was a criminal charge, and that has changed quite a bit. Obviously, now we have our Libel and Slander Act, which supplements the common law, but there is a great body of common law coming out of England and every other common law jurisdiction that followed it. So just basically, you've heard probably a number of words over the years, defamation, slander, and libel. And the differences between them it's actually pretty simple. Defamation is the whole enchilada, so it doesn't matter how you defame someone, what medium you use. It does matter for the purposes of the torts of slander. Slander is an oral communication. Libel, which is the much more common method, is a written communication. And as we know now, written communication means a lot more than just pen and paper. It, of course, primarily now relates to internet libel, which is obviously now in this day and age, the most common method of libeling someone, and in fact, by far and away the most damaging and lasting method of doing so. So in order to prove defamation, you have to prove the statement was defamatory. That goes back to it holds somebody up in a light that puts that person up to ridicule or contempt by others. This is a key point, is the statement has to be made in reference to the actual plaintiff. I'm going to talk about a case maybe some of you heard about that I was involved with a number of years ago that was primarily determined on the fact that the statement, while potentially libelous of somebody, was not libelous of that particular plaintiff, and therefore the plaintiff lost. So in that particular instance, you have to prove that the statement is directed to you. So the plaintiff must say they're bringing me down. I can't say, you can't be referring to people generally. You can't be referring to somebody else. Then the third aspect of it is that the words were published or disseminated. And I will say that today that's very easy to prove. We're not in the age where publication used to be a fairly limited group. Not a lot of people had printing presses and were running around publishing newspapers. Today, as I'm going to talk about later, everybody's got a printing press. The barrier to entry to libel is zero. If you've got a smartphone, you can libel somebody. And you can publish it, and probably far more widespread than any newspaper ever could 50 years ago. So defamation is basically a strict liability tort. And when I talk about that, strict liability means if you do it, you're liable. There's no potential mental element to the tort, although while I'll get into it, if there is a mental element, it's worse for you. But if you've defamed someone, then the tables turn, and it's up to you as the defamer to defend yourself on a number of bases. So there is a requirement, of course, that the publication itself must have been intended or negligent. It can't be some inadvertent slip, although that'd be difficult to imagine. And publication, as I say, may be inferred if you've produced it to any number of persons, including one. So a letter could be a publication. The statement must be defamatory, which I think we talked about a little bit, tend to lower the person in the estimation of right-thinking people. One of the elements that gets into it is innuendo. What does innuendo mean? I can't say, Lorne Saltman is a criminal. I could say Lorne Saltman is someone who does not think about the law very carefully in his conduct. There's an innuendo that Lorne Saltman is a criminal. That's really the inference. Innuendo is really the smell, if you will, around the words. There is liability for defamatory comments. I'm just over-clicked here. But let's go to this issue of statement must reference the plaintiff. But that's quite, and it's just, I bring it up because there was a case I was involved in a number of years ago for the former mayor of Toronto, the late mayor of Toronto. And he was sued in a very high-profile case, probably particularly because it was him, that got an enormous amount of media attention. And one of the issues was, in that particular case, was a gentleman who owned a restaurant, and he had claimed that comments that the late Rob Ford had made to the Toronto Sun's editorial board had defamed him personally. And what the comment was that there was a reference to corruption and skullduggery, and he said he's referring to me, he's calling me corrupt. Meanwhile, that was a very significant issue in the trial from a legal perspective. So the plaintiff must prove that the ordinary and sensible person familiar with the plaintiff would understand the words referred to him or her. And in that particular case, the record of the editorial board meeting showed that Rob Ford had never used this person's name. In fact, the evidence was he'd never heard of him. He did refer to the restaurant, which was a corporation. So the question was if these words were defamatory of the corporation, could the individual plaintiff sue for them? And he said, well, of course, because I'm the alter ego of this company. Everybody who sees this company sees me. I'm the face of the company. In that particular case, and you may remember it, I particularly love this headline. It was my favorite of all time, as any litigation lawyer would want. And so you bring the other side to tears of trial. But in any event, the fact of the matter was he was not. And the words referred to a corporation, and the guts of the decision were that the words, even if they were defamatory, weren't defamatory of that particular individual plaintiff because his name was never mentioned. And for the most part, your average person had no idea that he was the, quote, face of this restaurant. The restaurant had a name. The name was on the side of the building. It wasn't a big picture of his face on the side of the building. Maybe if he had defamed Kentucky Fried Chicken, Colonel Sanders might have had a claim, but this particular individual did not. And he was unsuccessful. The case went to the Court of Appeal where it was upheld, and he ended up paying a lot of money in costs to the late Rob Ford. In that regard, so the issue on defamation, again, I'm going to get quickly through this because I don't want to get to the real issue that I think is of primary importance today. The statement must be published to a third party. Publication is the final criteria the plaintiff must prove in order to make a successful claim in defamation. And this is important. The Libel and Slander Act does not necessarily encompass internet publication, but it likely does now with respect to many of the aspects of publication. The case law is sort of caught up with that. Defenses. So in other words, if you're found to have published something that is defamatory or brings the estimation of a individual down in the minds of right-thinking people otherwise, you've got the table turns, as I say, and you've got a series of defenses. The best, probably the most common one is, it was true. Lorne really is a dog criminal. I'm just kidding, of course. But the truth of the matter, truth is a complete defense. It's referred to as justification, and that is absolutely, it's a dangerous defense because many people use it, and it will blow up in your face, because if in fact it is shown that it is not true and you maintain that position through a trial, you are going to get buried in damages because you've aggravated the original libel. Absolute privilege. You often heard in the House of Commons, for example, the Comeau step outside and say that it's not because they're going to go out there and punch each other out. It's because within Parliament there is an absolute privilege with respect to what you say. So you can say anything you want about someone in Parliament, and you'll say, come outside and say that, and they say that because they want to sue you. Because once you step out of the cone of silence, if you will, of Parliament, it's open season. Qualified privilege is, just as the name suggests, there are occasions where the law wants to give protection to people to speak somewhat freely, and there are many instances of that. One instance that is quite common is if you call the police. I mean, for example, you drive on the highway and you see report drunk driver. And so, you see report drunk driver. So you call some guy swerving all over the road, and you're wondering what this guy's hammered. So you call 911. This person in plate number ACWS or whatever it is driving all over the road. They're drunk, and the police go and they arrest the guy. And he goes, "I'm not drunk. I dropped my phone. I dropped my my keys, or I was trying to swerve to avoid a squirrel that was running across the road, or some of this nonsense." Who said that I was drunk? And they've defamed me. But the fact is that that's an issue and an element of qualified privilege. We want people to call the police in those particular instances. You don't want someone to pick up the phone. I got to call drunk. Oh, I don't want to get sued for libel. I better be careful what I say. And remember, it would be a libel because your 911 call would be recorded, which would be a publication. So the fair comment is generally called it's the opinion. It depends on the nature of the circumstances. If it's an issue of public interest and there is a time for debate, there is a possibility to have opinions. Everyone and there's a defense, therefore, of fair privilege, fair comment, probably. Pardon me. Responsible communication has become really the complete barrier for newspapers and journalists. It's supplemented now by the new SLAPP legislation, but responsible communication basically means you got to give both sides of the story. And that came out of a case called Grant and Torstar that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, probably the leading case on defamation and libel. But if you give both sides of the equation an opportunity to put their comments forward, then that is generally considered to be responsible communication or responsible journalism. It is not sort of the slander pieces that we see. Now, it's interesting because as we see now, balance in journalism, I don't know if any of you watch CNN and Fox, but there's absolutely doesn't seem to be a lot of balance in journalism left. But the balance is really the key component of the responsible communication defense. Consent is that everybody agreed that the gloves were off in terms of these comments, and therefore the plaintiff has no claim. Damages are always an interesting issue in libel cases because they're whatever the court says they are. Usually in any civil lawsuit, there's a requirement to prove damage, which is the sense that your conduct has caused me the loss, and this is the loss that your conduct has caused. Not so in libel. The court sort of goes like this and says, well, I think, this particular individual, that particular comment, they had a very good reputation. So I'll give them $1 million. One of the classic cases was the Hill v. Church of Scientology case, where a defense counsel, Mr. Manning, had defamed the prosecutor, Casey Hill, and called him a crook and whatever on the courthouse steps, and the court gave the prosecutor, Mr. Hill, $1 million. That is an enormous libel damage claim. Usually, to be perfectly frank, the damages in libel cases are fairly nominal. It's more of the court is really signaling not so much that they're going to compensate you for the loss of your reputation, but it's really to send a message that the original comment was inappropriate, and there's a serious messaging component of it. So the damage numbers tend to be relatively small. I mean, when I say relatively small, $50,000 to $100,000. Most libel cases are not economic exercises. People don't sue people for libel because they're actually trying to recover monies that they've lost. They sue people for libel for fairly emotional reasons. That's not the case with respect to corporations, which is interesting. Corporations cannot be libeled in the sense of getting general damages. They actually have to show their balance sheet that says, I've lost X amount of dollars as a result of this libel. And so it is a big difference from individuals to corporations. There are serious aggravated and punitive and special damages involved in libel depending on the nature of the libel. And it really goes to one of the key issues in libel cases is malice, which is the intention of someone uttering the word. So if you had no malice in what you said, generally speaking, you would have all of the defenses that we talked about earlier, and the damage claim would be fairly nominal. If you said something knowing it to be untrue for the specific purpose of harming someone else, you're in a lot of trouble as far as it goes with respect to all of the general defenses of absolute privilege, and that will not apply. Malice will get rid of all of those. Plus, you will be looking at multiples in terms of damages based on your intention. So intention is still a very important part. Now, going forward, the practical consideration is now everyone, as I said, is a publisher. And I put forward a series of social media sites that anyone can be a publisher. And those sites are prolific and in a true sense. So in defamation now, and this is a quote that actually came out of a recent case in the Yukon, this is the key point of a defamation online is that it's really never going to go away. It is always searchable and findable, and it is published to an infinite number of people. So the breadth and distribution of defamation in the age of social media, in the age of the internet, is beyond anything that any newspaper or magazine could have ever hoped to have accomplished at that point. So the reputational risk and the risk that a publisher of a defamatory comment, however simply and easily it may have been done, is now multiplied exponentially. A couple of things. If your business has been defamed, in my view, it's time to act quickly. The idea here is to limit the damage. You can get injunctions. You can have items removed from Twitter. We have items removed from Facebook. We've had Facebook pages shut down. All those things. So get counsel involved immediately. There are serious jurisdictional considerations. Canada is a fairly libel-friendly jurisdiction, unlike the United States. The United States is fairly difficult to be successful on a libel case. Free speech is a religion in the United States, not so much a constitutional right. So there is really this notion that libel, I mean, Donald Trump has been talking about reviving libel laws, but other than Donald Trump, they are fairly open season down there on what you want to say about people. If your business has been defamed, one of the key things is what are you going to do? Are you going to fight it? If you fight it, you probably bring attention to it. So one of the things that has occurred recently, and I've been involved in on a number, is you can bury it. So, for example, search engines, and that's one of the key problems. If you searched and this terrible article comes up about you every time somebody searches you on Google, there are ways to bury those in search engines. There are electronically, so that they're just basically unfindable. They're still findable, but not really. Letters from lawyers, they work sometimes. It depends on who you're dealing with. The problem is a lot of these people are loonies, and you'll get some loony sitting with a computer in their basement, and all they want to do is put Twitter posts about how awful someone who they hate is. Legal action is, obviously, still available. It's an extraordinarily expensive proposition, depending on the defendant. And as I said, one of the key problems is sometimes you are dealing with people who really are quite loony, and usually the loonies don't have any money, which is a problem. It is defamation because, I mean, insofar as the product is defaming the corporation who made the product, and it really depends on what the nature of the comment is. And that you really get into the fair comment defense at that particular instance. If I really didn't like the restaurant that I went to last night and I put a terrible review up on TripAdvisor, then yeah. But I think what you get into, and what the real problem here is, there's a number of cases come out about this. You'll get, for example, competitors who just plaster TripAdvisor comes to mind. But the competition is a terrible hotel, full of cockroaches, there's rats running around, and none of it's true. And that is a malicious defamation of the corporation. So, it really will depend on the nature of the comment and the nature of the business. So if your business has been, if you've defamed somebody else, and this can happen regularly too. Remember, many people within corporations have access to the platform of the corporation's Twitter feed, or we've seen a number of instances of that where departing employees have decided to take one last shot by posting something quite horrible on the internet from the Twitter feed of the company. You need to contain it. And one of the key things is remove it. Retractions or apologies, they really work. They work in they particularly work in the legal sense in terms of taking what I've referred to as the sting out of the libel. So if there's an apology, and you may still get sued, but quite frankly, it will reduce enormously, if not eliminate, the damage claim. Preserve the evidence, that's another big issue. Don't get caught with trying to erase things. As I said, I don't believe anything can actually be erased anymore. And if you are erasing and deleting, as Mr. Livingston, the Premier's former Chief of Staff, will attest to, it's sometimes the elimination of the evidence is worse than not having it at all. So thanks very much. I don't know if there's any questions, but I think I'm out of time.
Resolution of an issue will there on especially state planning. There's a lot of organizations taking planning around. Some of them obviously valid, some we don't know.
Right.
I'm wondering what is that relationship with the issue hasn't been determined, but someone is alleged, and usually that the information actually
they have to determine it. That would be an issue for the trial. The issue for the trial will be, was it true? And if it's true and that's your defense, that's a complete defense. So, for example, if there was an allegation that I'd been defamed, that someone said, oh, for whatever I did this, and I said I never did it, never happened, and they're saying that I did so is defamatory. The issue for trial would be whether I did what they say I did, or whether I'm telling the truth. So some libel trials will really boil down to it. As I said, it's explosive. Because if you lose on that, it's not like one of those defenses that you can just throw out there in sort of your litany of defenses. If you lose on that one and you've maintained that position all the way through, you can really get whacked at the end of it.
Do you think there'll be some problems in your area coming up with King Street stuff? Because really the government, there are ways of improving the traffic that they don't consider because their way is the highway. But now the merchants are losing money. They're saying things. You had the big finger. Is that going to cause some of these problems?
I don't know. I don't know if it comes back to whether the finger was actually pointed at Mr. Tory or not. So I think I think that that would really fall into a number of issues on fair comment and qualified privilege, because it's the right of the citizens to criticize the government and to criticize government policies insofar as they're hurting them. I think the King Street vendors have a much better claim in terms of business interruption, in terms of a targeted misfeasance in public office, for example, rather than a defamation claim. And I can't really see too many counselors saying that they have been defamed by the business owners on King Street. And perhaps the business owner on King Street would have the truth defense, in the sense that if they say, listen, I was selling, $10,000 a night before this, and now I'm selling $1,000 a night, it sounds like that would be a complete defense to any defamation action.
Those numbers are
Truth. And truth is a defense. Right. Yes. It is, and that they may translate into the crazies that I've referred to, but maybe not. The truth is, most people don't do anything about it. There are ways to bury those on the internet. There are ways to go to the actual platform and saying you're hosting a defamatory comment, and if you continue to do so, I'm going to hold you liable as a publisher. And there's a big fight about that. There was a case with the Supreme Court of Canada about Google, and Google says we're not responsible for the content. That's not our fault. We're just sort of the platform host. We don't publish anything. We're the paper, if you will, not the person who's writing on it. So it's a very live issue right now, but quite frankly, you got to find someone who cares enough and is scared enough, in other words, that they've got money to lose, and it may be the host of the site. Anyways, I better get out of the way. There's much more interesting topic coming along. Thank you very much.
It's now up to you to talk about METOO and all of the current imbroglio that we're seeing daily in the papers, on the news, and so on. And we've talked about how
and what I call guillotine justice, as we've been watching, and the law of sexual harassment. I'm going to play you a little clip that you all remember when Matt...
Calling this a revolution of sorts.
This is a revolution. This is the next installment of the sexual revolution. More about power than it is about sex. But it is absolutely a revolution, and it's not going away.
A lot of people are talking about this. Are you getting calls from clients?
I'm getting a lot of calls from clients who are concerned that any kind of allegation will get them fired. That is not how this works.
Well, I got half of it right. It is a revolution, and when I first said it was a revolution, a number of people said, well, that's quite a strident statement. But I understood that the depth and the breadth of women's, particularly women's experience with respect to sexual harassment was so deep that I knew that once the lid had come off, that it wasn't going away anytime soon. And my male colleagues kept saying, men get sexually harassed too. And I thought, okay, well, we're all in the same pot together. The part where I say this is not how it works, well, it has been working that way. Apparently now you just have to make an allegation and heads will roll. But it's not supposed to work that way. The law with respect to sexual harassment has been the following. When an allegation comes, we're supposed to take it seriously. We are supposed to decide whether the accused person can stay in the environment or whether they should be suspended. We are supposed to decide whether that suspension should be paid or unpaid, and then we're supposed to have a full-on investigation. We are supposed to keep it confidential, and then we're supposed to make a fair and unbiased decision on whether the accusations are true. Sometimes they may be true, but you have to have enough evidence to fire somebody, to ruin their reputation. But that's not what's going on anymore. You just go on social media and you can then have things, heads roll. So I have to speed. Thank you. So I initially, when I spoke about this a few months ago, I used to say we've been Weinsteined, and we have been, which is there's been a tsunami in terms of complaints. That's not a bad thing, because there's been a lot of abuse for decades, for generations. And as you know, a number of high-profile people have been accused of sexual harassment, of assault, of rape. You recognize some of these names. Look at Kevin Spacey, 24 accusations against him, some of it really shocking. In Canada, Patrick Brown, Toronto, watching Patrick Brown lose his position immediately. And I don't know if some of you read Rosie DiMano's article about how, when I'm not so sure, neither is she, that that's really sexual harassment. It may be poor judgment in terms of behavior, but there was no analysis of what was happening. He was in his mid-20s in the first incident when he was at a bar asking a woman he thought was 19, at least, because she's drinking at the bar. The second one, they go to his house. She says no. He drives her home. In terms of the law of sexual harassment, that's not really sexual harassment. It may be poor judgment for a parliamentarian. It may, to some it looks creepy in terms of what you're doing in your personal life, but the law of sexual harassment is non-consensual behavior. Non-consensual behavior, and you can change your mind. But we have now moved it to a place where, as a lawyer, it's very difficult to defend someone because they're already damaged by the time they come to you. I'm now having people call me, senior people in this city, saying, I might get a Me Too movement thing. What are you going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? You want to retain me to do something that you think is going to happen. We don't know the content, but the damage is going to be instantaneous. Let's look at some of the stats around the Me Too movement. So in the first week, there was 1 million, was used 1 million times. That was used on Facebook by more than 4.7 million people. 45% of people in the U.S. used it on Facebook. Over 5 billion people saw a Me Too tweet. So it really is a revolution, and it's not going to go away. The fact that it's not going to go away is a good thing because we need to change the abusive behavior, but managing it in a way that's fair to everybody has become a real challenge from a legal perspective. And we know that this movement is continuing because the Women's March is continuing in Washington. We know that the Times Magazine Person of the Year was a silence breaker. All of these things you're all aware of. But of course, not everyone gets it. And here's a cartoon with Weinstein, Bill Cosby, and the president. I think what matters is language, and we are just throwing everything into one big pot now, and that pot is really sexual misconduct. So if you have a bad date, that's sexual misconduct. Maybe if there's a rape, it's sexual misconduct. If it's an assault, but it's not all the same. Sexual assault is not rape. Sexual misconduct is not sexual assault. Conflict of interest, which is what I think Patrick Brown was doing in the second scenario where he's offering this woman a job and offering to take her to India, that's a conflict of interest. That's worth talking about because parliamentarians should not be putting themselves, and people in power should not be putting themselves in conflicts of interest because then they can't do their job. But that's not rape. It's not sexual harassment necessarily. So we are getting confused in terms of language. A lot of people are saying to me, we've gone too far. There's going to be a backlash. I don't know that we've gone too far in the sense that we need to fix this. We need to fix, obviously, what we understand to be a deep experience of abuse of women and men. And it's not just tied to sexual issues. Obviously, there's now discussions about a larger experience of harassment, bullying, and those are important topics. So in this process, all of you have a say. All of you have a voice, and it matters because this is not some law that's, ivory towers, and it doesn't matter. It actually affects all of our lives. So what is sexual harassment? Really, it's about a question of power. Lauren O'Connor, who sued the Weinstein Company, said, I'm a 28-year-old woman trying to make a living and a career. Harvey Weinstein is 64 years old, world-famous man, and this is his company. The balance of power is me 0 and Harvey Weinstein 10. And that is one of the key things of harassment, because what I see in my practice, which in over 20 years, is that power dynamic. And it's usually somebody very senior going after somebody very junior because they understand that it's about power. What else is it about? It's about consent. Because you can have the similar fact scenario, and it could be a great date. Somebody can end up getting married, or you could end up with a sexual harassment complaint. It's about consent, and consent has to be given freely and continuously. Nonverbal signs are difficult to read, so you have to ask people. Consent can be withdrawn at any time, and consent is not possible in relationships where there's a power imbalance, such as boss and employee, doctor and patient, coach and teacher and student, adult and minor, and for lawyers here, articling students and partners. It doesn't matter. You can't give consent because you are not in a position to give consent. In the workplace, if a person has the ability to control or make decisions which would affect the other person's career, you can't give consent. So, about 10 years ago, when the multinational company said to me, I want you to draft up an anti-romance policies. It was an American company, and I said, well, I could draft it up, but it's not going to be upheld. First they wanted an anti-romance policy, then they said, okay, do a romance policy. In other words, you sign off, I am romantically involved with this person, it's all consensual, it's all good. I said, well, that won't work either because you can change your mind. This is a fluid thing, and it should be because we're human beings. We get to think and we get to choose. So then where is the line here? We know that 40% of people at some point in time have been involved in a workplace relationship. And I don't mean 40% of your coworkers are having a relationship right now with somebody at work. I just mean at at one point in time. And that number, I bet you, is not accurate because not everybody will admit, right? So I suspect at least half of the working population have had a workplace romance or fling or whatever you want to call it. So that means we can't just treat this, as some of my partners have said, we should have a policy where you can't have any involvement with anybody. Well, you could, again, draft that policy, but you're never going to really be able to implement it in reality. So we should live in real terms. So we understand that people get involved. We understand that consent can't be written up in a piece of paper because you can change your mind, but you can always ask. In terms of the law, here's what the law says. 2 pieces of legislation protecting it. The Ontario Human Rights Code, which says every person who's an employee has a right to freedom from harassment in the workplace because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression by his or her employer or the agent of the employer or by another employee. So it's not just restricted to your boss. It is not just restricted to the physical working environment. It's everybody that you come in contact with at work. The next perspective, every person has a right to be free from a sexual solicitation or advance made by a person in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit or advancement to the person where the person making the solicitation or advance knows or ought reasonably to know that it is unwelcome. So you can't make a solicitation if you should know in the circumstances that it's not welcome. Well, I know people have a lot of trouble with that concept, but if you go back to a concept of power dynamics, you should know that the person is not in a position to grant you the consent that you need here. A reprisal or a threat of reprisal for the rejection of a sexual solicitation or advance, or that reprisal is made or threatened by a person in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit or advancement. In other words, you can't take reprisal action, and that happens all the time, even though you're not supposed to. If somebody denies or does not want the sexual advance, often people will act in a way that constitutes reprisal action. Not supposed to do that either. The other piece of legislation that protects against sexual harassment is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it says that if you have more than 5 employees, you must have workplace violence and harassment policies in writing. They must be reviewed annually and posted visibly in the workplace. Most companies are in breach of that. I'm going to skip through some of this. Let me tell you that when we look at statistics, 43% of Canadian women and 12% of Canadian men say they've experienced sexual harassment at work. 87% say they believe the next generation will experience the same amount. and 4 out of 5 believe the next generation will experience the same amount of sexual assault as the current. Now, these stats are before the MeToo movement. All right, we don't have new stats. We looked, right, Madalena? We looked, and so I think these stats are they're going to differ. I think the first one where it says 43%, I think you're going to see an increase. I think people are going to tell you the truth that they've been sexually harassed. But I don't think that we're going to be so doom and gloomy about things continuing. I don't think 87% is going to think that it's going to continue on. The government of Canada did its own survey last year, again, high numbers of experiences of sexual harassment. So why does it continue? Why has it continued for so long? It continues because it's institutionalized. And the perfect example of it is Harvey Weinstein's employment contract. I don't know if all of you knew about this. It had a clause that says, Harvey, you will pay the company liquidated damages of $250 for the first instance, $500 for the second, $750 for the third, and $1 million for each additional. Well, you are institutionalizing his bad behavior. This is a ridiculous example, but it makes the point that the harassment is continued because it is institutionalized. His apology was beautiful. It said, I came of age in the 60s and 70s when all the rules about behavior in workplaces were different. That was the culture then. What he was saying was, I'm an older man, and I hear this all the time. And up until a couple of years ago, saying I'm an older man and I didn't get it used to work. I apparently have 1 minute, so I'm going to go very quickly through some cases with you. The older man exception will get you in a lot of trouble now. You go to court and you say, I did this because I didn't get it because I grew up in the 60s. The judge is going to make you pay a lot more money. So the older man exception in law now means big bucks. So here's very quickly the story of Michelle. Worked in a jewelry store. Her boss was doing things to her he shouldn't have been doing, like massaging, touching, the usual situation. And then she goes, she gets fired. She sues for wrongful dismissal, sexual assault. I actually had no idea that everybody was asking for massages all over the place, which is kind of funny because I've been practicing for so long. She was there for a year and a half. She made $28,000. And she got $312,000. Big bucks. You go to court and you say, I didn't get it, big bucks, because don't forget the legal fees on top. So, another $200,000, $300,000 in terms of their legal costs. So get a masseuse instead of harassing your employees. The second kind of exception, I call it the Kevin Spacey exception, because oddly enough, people think they can pick on kids. They think they can pick on teenagers because, well, their economic ability, their knowledge of the world, their no access to power. So in this case, we had a kid, 14 years old, worked part-time, was being sexually harassed again, massaging away. And this kid got $15,000 tax-free for a part-time job for a couple of months. So if all of these kids bring cases to the Human Rights Tribunal, a lot of these small companies won't function anymore. They won't because they can't. And then that doesn't include the legal fees, right? And then what is 1 day of harassment worth? Because there's some industries where the moment you walk in the door, you're going to get harassed. One of them is being a server. And in this case, again, back to the same story. This new boss comes in. He says to her, I want to take you home. We're going to have a party of our own. I love you, right? You just met her, by the way. Of course, he grabs her everywhere that he shouldn't be grabbing. She complains, and she wants accommodations. He says, I don't want to work near him. They don't accommodate her. So she's a minimum, remember, she's a minimum wage, and this is before the minimum wage change in 2014. But still, minimum wage is still not a lot of money. What does she get? She gets almost $30,000 for 1 day of harassment. Nothing else. And now those numbers are going to go up. I promise you those numbers are going to go up because no judge is going to be able to sit there now with what is going on and give out $30,000. We're going to see 6 figures for what used to be $5,000, $10,000. There are also criminal consequences. If you're sexually assaulted, you don't have to go to civil court. You can go to criminal court, or you can do both. Or now you can go to social media. What to do? what are you going to do? If you're in a position of power, if you're the head of a company, if you're head of HR, if anybody reports to you, all of you people have responsibility. So how do you manage this? So you have to understand, and I'm sure you do, that the HR issues are about the heart and soul of an organization. It isn't something that is just for HR people or that you throw to the side. Good corporate governance necessitates strong HR policies. You must do annual reviews of your code of conduct, your HR policies. You must have human rights policies. There must be annual training. And right now, you must go back and look at your sexual harassment policies, because it turns out vague legal concepts are not going to be enough. I am drafting my policies for my clients, and it says things like, do not touch your coworkers here, there, and everywhere, because apparently people don't get it. But you put it in your policy and they've done it, company can't have much liability. If they've done it, they've trained you on it. In the first instance we find out that you've done this, you're on your own. You're going to have to pay the $600,000 fines, not us, not the company. Do more than that. Identify leaders that people feel comfortable with, because your policies are only as good as the people that implement them. They have to be people that people feel comfortable with, that they trust. There needs to be a formal and an informal complaint. Because if you make everything formal, you won't get any work done. All you're going to do all day long is manage formal complaints, because a lot of things can be dealt with informally. Ensure that employees know their complaints are held in confidence, although you will not be able to maintain confidentiality if it goes to court, obviously. And you won't be able to maintain it when you will have to speak to people who are involved in the investigation process. So language, nuanced language around confidentiality is important. But finally, the message from top down is that companies should not and will not tolerate harassment, assault, or abuse of power from any of its employees. And that's a good thing. And I think companies are taking this issue seriously now. And I've always said for such a long time, because I didn't understand why companies were not taking it seriously. If your employees are spending their time harassing other employees, they're not working, right? They're too busy trying to get dates and whatever else. So if no other reason, don't you want your employees to be productive? You're losing money. You're losing competitive advantage. Never mind everything else. And so when I would say that in a room of CEOs, they'd sit up and listen to me. But now they're listening because it's become a social movement, because you can't contain it. And all of us, in some way or another, are responsible for managing this. So exciting times. And do I have time for any questions? Are there any questions? Yes.
A quick one on the other side of the employment that is a non-union environment. Are companies going to just barely fire people who get paid notice just on an allegation? And is that an issue?
So what you're saying is you somebody fire them, give them notice, so what's the big deal?
No, I don't think it's right necessarily.
No, I agree.
That seems to be the natural reaction of companies, because otherwise, whether the allegation.
Right. So if you heard Gavin, so the wrongful dismissal law won't protect you from all aspects of it, because if it was managed badly, then if there's defamation involved, that person might take the wrongful dismissal, say, oh yeah, I'll take the wrongful dismissal, but I'm not going to sign off because I'm going to get this anyway. I'm going to sue you for defamation and the other person because I didn't do it. And now you've ruined my life, you've ruined my reputation, and the wrongful dismissal damages, as you know, for the most amount, it's the maximum is 2 years. It's not going to cover me. I'm 42 years old. I haven't worked till I'm 82. What am I going to do in between?
I agree with the company's not liable.
Yeah, yes, they are. If they're part of. No, how you manage the breaches of confidentiality, everything that you did. You might be violating your own code of conduct. That would be a breach of contract case on top of wrongful dismissal. Then there's the defamation aspect. The company will get sued along with the employees who may have gone on social media. So this is actually very serious in terms of going back. You should go back if you're managing HR in any way, or if you're managing a group. You've got to understand that it's very important right now, 2018, you must look at your policies. You must have very clear policies that take you away from the exact liability that you're talking about. Yes.
I'll have to cut it off here. Thank you all for staying with us. Hope you found it interesting and insightful. We will be here now that it's over. So the formal question